Nymphing is arguably the fly fishing method that most new anglers learn first, but a lot of your early education on nymphing was probably incomplete. Fly fishing with nymphs is much more than just slinging some bugs under an indicator and hoping for the best. There's actually a finesse and a science to it, just like there is with fishing dry flies. Plus, the ever important lessons about a good drift and proper presentation that you learn from nymphing will translate over to every other form of fly fishing. If you do not adequately understand nymphing, you are shortchanging your fly fishing education. On this week's episode of Untangled, we have the pleasure to learn from Domenick Swentosky about essential nymphing tactics that beginners just cannot afford to miss. Dom is the man behind Troutbitten, one of the best learning resources for fly anglers that's out there on the internet. He's also a dad, a guide, and one of the most thoughtful anglers that I've ever met. Dom's advice is the sort of in-depth yet easy to understand information I wish I'd had when I started nymphing. You do not want to miss this show. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone. Presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Grant, joined this week by none other than Domenick Swentosky. Dom is the man behind Troutbitten. Troutbitten is one of my favorite resources to go look to for educational and informative and just plain entertaining content. Dom does a fantastic job over there. It started out as sort of a diary for Dom to document what he wanted to someday show his sons, and then it evolved into the great learning resource that it currently is. It's got 1,000+ articles, videos, and podcast episodes currently over there, and that's a pretty impressive body of work, Dom. So don't let anybody tell you that it isn't.
Thank you.
But among the many things that I think Dom's an expert on, even though he claims that there are no experts in fly fishing.
No experts in fishing.
Well, I know a few people who would argue that point with you, Dom.
Yeah, fair enough.
But Dom really does know his way around fly fishing with nymphs, and that's the topic of this episode this week is the essential nymphing tactics that beginners need to focus on. But before we get into that part of the show, Dom, I would like for listeners, viewers to get to know you a little bit better. So share a bit more about yourself. Tell us your fish story as well. It's something I love to ask folks about. You know, how'd you get started in fishing, and why is it something that's kept you captivated for so long? Because you don't do this at the level you're doing it if it's not something that's almost second nature to you. So I'd love to hear about that.
Well, thanks for having me, Spencer. What's it been? A year and something maybe since we did this last?
Oh, it's been longer than that, man. It's been almost 2. Yeah, I know. Time flies.
Things roll together.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for that question. It's captivated me since I was real young. I grew up in Western PA with stocked streams. So the fishing season was way shorter, but for me now in Central PA, the fishing opportunities never stop. But back then, maybe it was good for a kid to not I never had enough fishing, right? Because it was basically from early April until middle of June. There was a fishing season. That's what I thought of it as, because we were trout fishermen. And I would dabble in the summer with some bass tactics and into ponds and things like that for bluegill and whatnot. But I always just wanted to fish more. And, well, then you know my life story, but I came up here to Central PA to go to school, left for just a little bit, and then I was really excited to come back because I know the kind of fishing that was here. And I've been here ever since. I'm never leaving. I guess what captivates
not even
me
for the Rocky Mountains.
No, I'm not. You can't. Like I got buddies out your way. I think the very attractive point about being right here for me is because it really is a year-round endeavor. These fish, they really do. They eat all year round. They're not even in just like slow water. Oh, wintertime, they're hunkered down, but you got to put it right in their face. Nah, we have pretty good action here in the winter too. Although it hasn't been much of a winter, to be quite honest. I'm missing it. Only fished in the snow like 3 or 4 times.
Oh yeah,
this year.
We just got snowed on last just this past weekend. I was fishing in fresh snow on Sunday, actually.
Oh, I
So
love it.
it
There's
was
nothing
great.
like
Little
it.
blue wing olive hatch in early February. It's hard to beat
Boy, no
that.
kidding.
Yeah, there's a little tailwater here not far from me that gets
Mm-hmm.
little blue wings like 18s and 16s, and then a
Yeah.
pretty good midge hatch because those are always going on. But that's
Sweet.
about the only thing that's not frozen right now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, everything else is locked up under ice.
Well,
So
those opportunities will keep you going. Um, all the variation that's here too, the variety of stream styles, opportunities. I don't know. It's the constant mystery, the constant guessing, and then trying to figure stuff out. I always say that's what attracts me to the fly rod in the first place because you can do anything that the fish want you to do, and trout can be pretty particular, as we know. So you're not going to go out there and use the same rooster tail every day, right? It doesn't work like that, and I'm thankful for that. I had a guy tell me the other day. He was from England. And he was saying that these streams that they fish, and he's a comp guy, and he was saying, he said, I'm telling you, we catch 100 fish in a 4 hour session. And I'm like, I don't want to catch 100 fish in a 4 hour session. Like, I don't. I'm going to say that makes it pretty easy. And so there probably isn't a whole lot to figure out if you're just hammering fish like that. And so, oh my, we don't catch numbers like that at all. And I'm thankful for that. I really am, because there is a different mystery tomorrow um, than there was today. And as you know, it'll change from moment to moment. And then maybe you do kind of get something figured out, and you're doing it pretty well, and it seemed to be in an agreement with the fish. And then you decide, all right, I'm going to throw streamers, or I'm going to throw dries or nymphs, or just change things up. You have all those options, and I know it really is. That's what keeps me going.
yeah, no, I love it. That's you articulated it better than I could. To be completely honest, that really is
I
a
think we
big
all feel pretty similar.
yeah. We
You're a
do.
lifelong angler too,
Yep.
and yeah, I think that's what drives most of us. You meet people across the industry, and I told I told a guy I was talking to today, we had a one-on-one session, and I said, John, I don't even like people. which is which is true. Like, in general, whatever, I'm an introvert, and I like being by myself, but I like fishermen. I like anglers. I like talking to people that are into fishing, like yourself, and like so many people out there listening. um, and I think we all share that common wish to solve a mystery. And maybe that's what I know. We all kind of complicate, not all of us, but I get accused of complicating things, and that's fair, right? I do want to know every possible nuance. I won't live long enough to figure much out.
Yeah, but if you're fly fishing, anyways, you're kind of, at least in my mind, I think you are accepting the fact that you're complicating it already. Because if we were going to
Yeah,
boil it down to its essence, you put a
fair.
worm on a hook or some other kind of bait because that's the most effective way to put fish in the net, other short of just netting the fish directly. But uh, it's interesting.
Yeah,
People accuse
that's
you of complicating it because I
yeah,
think it's already inherently complicated.
yeah. That's a point. I remember talking to guys in the fly shop. I argued with them. This is a long time ago in TCO. I think it was Paul Weimer I was arguing with, friendly argument. Um, and I said, I don't think I could catch more with bait um, than nymphs, let's say. And we're going to talk about nymphs because trout are eating small things that are dead drifted under there. And that's pretty hard to do with a spinning rod, you know. And I was a pretty good bait fisherman. I grew up that way. We talked about that last time. And I think, yeah, well, I've gone back. That was a long time ago. About 5 or 6 summers ago, I did. I bait fished in the summer, but then again, it was summertime. I don't know that it's a fair comparison, but I think even with more knowledge about trout rivers and about the trout themselves, if I went back to bait, minnows, worms, I don't think I'd catch as many as, like,
Really?
well, good nymphing tactics. I really don't.
Hmm.
I might be
Yeah,
wrong. And maybe it's
that'd be a
just in these
really
rivers,
interesting.
wouldn't
That'd
it?
be a real interesting video for folks to do. Like go
I
out
know.
there and fish the same stretch of river together, but with one guy's with bait, one guy's with flies, and see who comes out on top. Because that's always
Yeah.
kind of been the refrain, I think, industry wide is like, if we wanted simple, if we wanted easy, if we wanted to just catch fish, we'd use bait. Maybe you're right. Maybe maybe it isn't that simple in a river.
No, I
Maybe
don't
we're
think it is.
oversimplifying it when we say that.
Yeah,
But speaking of nymphs, though, let's chat. Let's chat a little bit about
hmm
nymphing,
sure.
because this is something that especially beginners, and that's a lot of who our listeners are, and it's interesting. I really love having you on for this
Thanks.
reason, Don, because you're so thoughtful about your answers and about how you approach this stuff, and I think that's something beginners especially need to adopt is that mentality of a thoughtful approach to this. It's not.
Mm,
So often we see this play out where it's, and I'm sure you see it all the time. The questions that get asked are, okay, well, what flies are they hitting on,
yeah,
or what are they biting on today? And it's like, well, I I don't know. You've got to go and figure it out. There is no like go here, tie this on, catch fish
yeah,
sort of prescription, and there might be for some rivers, like a San Juan worm is going to work on the San Juan, right? That's where it got its name.
hmm
Scuds are going to work in a lot of places, but it never really is that prescriptive of an operation. There's a lot more
yeah,
that goes into it. You have to be willing to take that, willing to accept that,
yeah,
and approach every day like it's new, like it's different, because every day
mm,
is new, and every day, excuse me, every day is different.
yeah,
I mean, just yesterday I was out fishing with a buddy of mine, and I've been talking up the blue wing hats that I mentioned
mm,
earlier. The blue wings have just been coming off like
mm.
crazy, and I told him, I said, this is some of the easiest and some of the best blue wing fishing I've had
Yeah.
ever.
Don't get spoiled. Yeah.
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
went, and I think between us we caught 6 fish. It
Oh,
was
I
it
thought it was
was
going to be better.
no, it was so tough because I think word finally got out that the blue wings
Oh, okay.
were hatching,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they were acting very much more like pressured fish. They weren't acting
hmm
like the naive fish that they'd been
Yeah.
for the last 2 or 3 weeks, because the
Yeah.
hatch really didn't start up until the last
hmm
2 or 3 weeks. And my buddy was asking me, well, what was different today? And I didn't have an honest answer for him because there were more bugs on the water and more fish rising than I'd seen, but they
Yeah.
were much more selective. They wanted a perfect drift. The last couple of
Mm.
weeks, I could get away with an imperfect drift,
hmm
but it had to be right in their lane yesterday too. Uh, and that just circles back to this whole point, which is it's always going to be different every time you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
out there.
We're
I
thankful
think,
for that.
yeah, exactly. Like you said, we're thankful for it. And I still don't know what was different yesterday. I think I
Hmm.
screwed up a little bit of it because um, I think my tippet was a little too thick, and I think they were finally a little too tippet shy.
Hmm.
And I was fishing a true dry fly rig, well, a parachute dry and then an emerger behind it.
hmm
And I think the thicker tippet to that first parachute was what was putting them off, but I have no idea. I'd have to go
hmm
back and find out. But unfortunately, I had to go to work, so I didn't get to go back to find out.
You got to quit your job so you
Oh,
can fish
I'm
more.
working on it. I'm working on it.
I know.
Oh, but anyways, so we've got these beginners out there. We're talking about a thoughtful approach. What would you consider are the basic skills that an angler needs if they want to be successful while they're out there, particularly throwing nymphs, but a lot of this we can say applies to dries, dry droppers, streamers, etc. But specifically with nymphs, what are the
Mm.
basic skills that you see folks needing if they want to be successful?
Boy, there is a lot to it, right? So it's hard to be basic about it. And yet, I do the same thing as you. I mean, I encounter people and try to help them out. I mean, I'll encounter beginners that need things to be broken down into basics. You have to start somewhere, and you can't just say, "Well, here, read all this and watch all these videos,"
Yep.
So it's going to come down to casting. It's going to come down to reading water. Don't worry so much about pattern selection. That's for sure. Um,
Why do you say that?
well,
Don't worry
pattern
about pattern
selection.
selection.
Yeah, patterns should just be reasonable. That's the way I put it. With nymphs, I think they're pickier on top than they are on nymphs. That's my experience. Um, I think everybody knows what a waltz worm is these days, and I'm sure everybody knows what a pheasant tail nymph is. And I know I could get away with those all year long. A couple different turns of twists on each one of those, I suppose. Could build in some flashy dubbing, or you could put a bead on both. Absolutely. Change that bead color then if you have a bead. Anyway, and I'd also want a couple other things. I tried to pare down nymph selection into a nice, tidy handful one time in an article, and I ended up with 17 nymphs. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's pretty trim, because it's true. So I'm saying two different things here. I realize it, but really, that collection of 17 nymphs got larger because I started thinking, well, I'd have to have a green weenie. Oh well, I'm gonna need that zebra midge, and and I'm gonna need this. I'm gonna need that San Juan worm or something similar. I want my junk flies.
Yep. You need
Um,
them.
yeah. So, but I just don't think. Well, that's my advice. That I don't think we should focus beginners too much on the pattern, because they're gonna do it anyway. You know, they're gonna. It's the easy out is to blame the fish or blame your pattern, and so that's perhaps another bit of advice. Never blame the fish. I wrote an article titled that as well. I never blame the fish until maybe I'm walking out to the truck, and maybe if I have a buddy there, we both, you know, got our butts handed to us by the fish, and we'll go, that was just tough. That really was. That was tough. Or if I'm by myself, whatever. Sometimes I do have to acknowledge, like, they were tough today, and I didn't
Yeah.
figure it out. And
Sometimes they
maybe
just
it
don't want to
was,
play.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it was that they just wouldn't eat. But when I'm fishing, I'm always thinking that they're not eating because it's something I'm doing. I blame myself instead of blaming the fish. I think that's a good way to approach it.
Yeah.
So
That's a
always try
really
to make that
healthy
drift
mindset.
better.
Yeah.
We're very focused on dead drifts, and I think we should be. On top, get a dead drift on a dry fly. That's your best bet. And yes, you can skitter and hop that dry fly if you're good at it, but it should come out of a dead drift. The dead drift should be the baseline. And so, I'm sure the same thing applies with a nymph underneath. And the dead drift needs to be the baseline. We've been walking through this on our own podcast. Um, these concepts and skills around nymphing, and it all comes down to a few basic things. So if you are nymphing, I always say, like, ask yourself these three questions. Um, am I low enough for long enough? Meaning, is my fly low enough for long enough? Is my nymph into that strike zone? Now, I don't know where your trout are going to be, but I'm saying if I fished tomorrow, I almost guarantee you that I would need to get my nymphs down into the strike zone, which is, we're not going to get real detailed about it. It's real close to the bottom, right? There's a cushion of water down there, and it's slower. So maybe that's low enough then. That's where I need to be. Maybe I need to be even lower that, though, the next day or the next river, or maybe in your river tomorrow. You would need to actually be kind of ticking that bottom, even lower than the strike zone. Or maybe it's May and you have a lot of sulfur nymphs hatching, and where the trout are actually feeding is somewhere up in the middle. Their vision, their target zone, their attention is up in the middle. And so then being right on the bottom would be kind of underneath where they're really paying attention to the most. So in that case, low enough for long enough, or well, low enough means middle column. So when I say, are you low enough for long enough, or is your fly, you don't necessarily mean am I ticking the bottom. Just we need to find that zone where trout are feeding and then really focus on it. So instead of having drifts that, like, just kind of drop, excuse me, that just kind of drop through the column the whole time and then eventually end up touching the bottom, and then I pick up and cast again, I try to get down into a zone, a target zone, and then keep the nymph there. So that's the one question. Am I low enough for long enough? And really, more important than that, a dead drift is in one lane. I've been harping on this for like a year, right? I'll kind of get with an idea and keep rolling on it, writing articles around it, doing podcasts around it. A dead drift is in one lane. We see it on the surface. And so, advice to a beginning nymphing, a beginning angler that wants to nymph as well, would be really learn to fish dries so that you can see what a dead drift looks like. You can see it. It's easy to see it on a dry fly. You could say, well, that's, oh, great, that's going right along with the bubbles, or that little leaf or whatever it is on the top. Great, it's right along with the surface current. And then you can easily see it. It starts to drag. It comes across seams. I don't find anybody that misses that. Anybody can see it, regardless of angler experience. And so you learn that on top, and then you got to take the same thing underneath. But now you know what it should look like, and now you're trying to take that same concept of back to this in one lane. Obviously, on top, you see when it crosses lanes, and now it drags, and you go, it's no good. Let me get it out of there. And so you're trying to take that same idea of staying in one lane underneath. Of course, that goes back to, or it really starts with how we read a river. Trout are obviously faced upstream. You need to understand that they are always faced upstream. Well, they're faced into the current. Of course, water goes in their mouth and then out the gills. That's how they breathe, so to speak. We know that. And the trout then are faced into one lane. They're looking in one lane. And I believe, from my experience, they don't see to the right and to the left. Well, they see. They're not focused as much to the right and to the left of them as they are straight ahead. So they know what things look like coming right down to them in their lane, in that lane. How wide's the lane? I don't know. 6 inches, 1 foot, 2 feet wide. I don't think any lane is really wider than about 2 feet. Even a really slow piece of water, all right, maybe 3 feet wide. But I think if you stand in a piece of pocket water or some mixed currents, you're going to realize, wow, even a 50-foot wide stream, oh gosh, you could have 30 lanes going across there, different speeds. And so we got to keep our nymphs in one lane. That's it. So am I low enough for long enough? Is my nymph in one lane so it can be a dead drift? And then I always say, like, the third question is, do I have to be that far away? And I don't care what nymphing method you're using, whether it's a tight line method or it's an indicator method. The closer you are, the better you're going to be. All sports are like that, right? I was struggling the other day to find a sport that isn't like that. A foul shot is easier in basketball than a 3-point shot, right? It's easier to hit a ground ball to third base than it is to crank one over the fence, right? Archery, well, all shooting is like that. You're going to be more accurate at closer range. I can't think of anything that it isn't more accurate and perhaps easier to achieve the results at closer distance like that. You don't want to spook the fish, but again, we're going to stay behind them. There's a lot to it, but these are kind of your basics. Am I low enough for long enough? Is my nymph in one lane? And do I really have to be that far away? Kind of keep yourself in check.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig into that. Am I in the right lane? I want to dig into that concept a little bit more, if you don't mind. I really like that phrasing of it. How, because that to me relates directly to reading water, correct?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to get your flies in the right spot, you've got to be able to read that water correctly. And I know for me, when I started out fly fishing, when I really started fly fishing, which was when was it? It was in high school for me.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, that was the hardest part for me. Was trying to figure out where to cast, especially in a river. I've got this distinct memory of me and my dad on the Lower Provo there in Utah, where I grew up. Me fishing a giant royal wolf in, I think it was like April, right through the rapids, and wondering why I wasn't getting fish. Because I had no clue. Because I'd grown up fishing a tiny little spring creek with my dad with dry flies, and that's all we would ever do. And I didn't understand where fish held. I didn't understand any of that stuff.
Sure.
And that's probably, I think, short of casting itself, it's probably one of the more intimidating parts of learning to fly fish, is learning how to read the water.
Read the water, yeah.
So what tips, I guess, do you have, or what ways do you like to teach folks to read water that you found helpful? Because you guide as well. That's one thing I didn't mention. You guide as well. I used to guide. I don't guide anymore. Well, I shouldn't say I don't guide anymore. I'm on guiding hiatus for a little bit. I'd love
Okay.
to get back into it.
You
It's
can't do
it's
everything
really
at
a lot of
once.
fun.
Yeah.
But how do you help folks read water? Because I know how I do it, but I'd
Mhm.
love to hear another perspective, especially somebody from the East Coast too, from,
Well, sure.
away from the Rockies. Because
Yeah.
I think y'all's approach to fly fishing is a little bit different. It's really interesting. It's different in a lot of good ways.
Yeah. Region is your region, your waters, um, and even, well, even physical abilities dictate a lot. But yeah, the region, where you're from, what your rivers really look like. Let me close this. Sorry about that. Um, it's it's going to dictate a lot for you, right? But if possible, I'd like to see beginners not fish the biggest river out there. I think we can learn to read water easier on small streams. I I grew up. I wished that there was trout water very, within walking distance before I had a driver's license. That's all I wanted, man. That little trickle. Okay, it wasn't a trickle, but it was 10 feet wide at the most. It was across the road, and I used to go down there and play around. There were there weren't even chubs or anything like that. Uh, there were no fish in there. But I learned, I guess you'd call it hydraulics. I'd learn how I would build rock dams, but more than that, I like push a piece of bank down and see what happened, and put float log parts down and see how they'd get stuck on a rock. So you learn. Well, I learned all of that stuff on a 10-foot, 5 to 10 foot wide, not trout river, and just goofing around. Now, I don't think you need to do that, but I am saying that the things you learn in those small waters are going to translate then to the medium sized waters. If you can find a piece of water that's 30 feet, 50 feet wide, maybe, I think that's a really nice stream to learn to read water on. You can pick it apart. The river will kind of show you, hey, here, this looks good, right? Like you caught a fish here last week, and this is also an undercut bank where it gets deeper. And then maybe you pick one up not in the deepest stuff, but right where, sort of where the gravel bar kind of deepens up a little bit. Or maybe it's under the hemlocks or whatever, right? There's more structure on smaller rivers. And we like that. Um, to be honest, when I go fish some of the bigger rivers, like north of here, um, I feel lost for about an hour. It takes me about an
Yeah.
hour to dial it back in. Or if I go to Western PA to some big rivers down there too. Um,
Well,
not
I really
completely
like hearing you
lost.
say that.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
really, because I feel that same way too. And
Yeah.
I don't, uh, you're older than me, so obviously you've been fishing longer than I have.
Mm.
I don't think that feeling of being lost ever
Mm-mm.
really goes away, does it?
No.
No.
And it might not last a whole hour necessarily, especially if I do know the water, if I've been there a number of times. There's an adjustment period. And I know these waters around here like the back of my hand, but I really do. But I love exploring the new stuff. Anyway, when it's a bigger piece of water, you don't have all the structure. There might not be one single rock that's sticking up above the surface, you know? There might not be undercut banks. Maybe the valley is really wide and you don't have underhanging or overhanging brush. Um, and everything just feels all exposed. Maybe you can't see in there and really be able to read the depth like you wish you could. Um, that's a tough place to learn, is what I'm saying. So I would not want to put a beginner in that kind of water if you could help it.
Well, I
I like the
agree.
small stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Getting with that small stuff is the way to do it. I like that quite a bit. Um, I think a big theme of what you're talking about is something that I've tried to preach, for lack of a better word, here as well, which is
Yeah.
there's a big need to be observant when you're
Oh
out
yeah.
on the water. Look at where you're catching the fish,
Hmm.
and at this stage, maybe you don't need to understand the why. Like, why are they in that scene? Why are
That's a
they
good point.
right there.
Good point. It doesn't matter necessarily why at first.
Yeah, it doesn't matter yet. Eventually,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get there. You'll understand it, and then
Yep.
that's going to inform your fishing. And that's when the switch really flips. I think when things really click is when you
Mm-hmm.
understand why the fish are where they are. But if you can just take note of where you caught those fish, then you know, okay, this is the water type I'm looking
Mm.
for. This is where I can expect these fish to be. I mean,
Yeah.
I think right after New Year's, we were out here in Wyoming on one of the only tailwaters that wasn't frozen, and because it
Mm.
got cold in January this year,
Mm.
and we were looking for those fish, and we found them all in. We thought they were going to be in completely just dead, almost no current water because it was so cold, but
Sure.
they weren't. They were in about halfway between really slow and walking speed water. They're like
Mm-hmm.
half pace water where
Mm-hmm.
we found them all. And once we figured out where that was, we caught a good chunk of fish that day.
Well, and to your point, it doesn't necessarily matter why they were there. And you and I can sit here and theorize about, well, I wonder why they were in that water instead of maybe what you expected. It doesn't matter as much as having the history. Now you have that story, and you can think about it next time you're in a situation perhaps similar. And that's probably how you end up figuring out why. Anyways, you stack experience on top of experience, and then maybe somebody else's experience if you have good fishing buddies, and you start to figure out that why. Otherwise, you're probably just guessing on the why without enough experience to kind of do your own research
Yeah.
on.
And that's probably why a lot of beginners feel so intimidated, right? Because
Oh
they
yeah,
go into it and they feel like they're guessing at everything.
and we
And
are, right?
yeah,
We
we,
were.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
I
that's
still am.
yeah, exactly. That's why I said we are. And
Yeah.
when we were beginners, though,
Yeah.
oh my, I I remember being almost in tears. It took me. There were rising trout over a hatch of really small. I thought they were tricos. The time of year it couldn't have been, so they must have been just little wee mid. I mean, they were tiny
You
midges.
get tricos out there in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, but not at the time of
Cool.
the day. I was going after work. This was when I was in college, kind of early. The point is, it took me like 10 trips before I finally caught one of those fish. And I'm sure it was an accident. Looking back on it, I don't even know why I caught one that day. It's just not easy at first because you are guessing about everything. You're right. Everything is a guess. Should you change the fly? Answers to my questions. Am I low enough for long enough? What the hell's that mean? That's what people are thinking. One lane, perhaps, is the easiest thing to understand because here's maybe another tip about reading water. This might be my best tip. Look at where you want your nymph to end up. Let's say something close to you. Again, let's say we're casting upstream, generally upstream. I'm not saying directly upstream, but upstream, and let's say over 10 feet and up 20 feet, 20 or 30 feet, right? That's a nice angle. Um, and so the river's sending your nymph back to you. And look where it's going to end up. And then look where that water comes from. And just literally follow it upstream. If it does have bubbles, we'll look at all that line of bubbles that's going upstream, and be very discriminating about it. Don't say, "Well, it's about it got that big wide bubble seam." Not good enough. Where's the inside of that bubble seam? Where's the real soft water that meets the bubble seam? Where's the faster water maybe on the other side of that bubble seam that's going quite a bit faster? And then where they meet is what I like to call merger seams, where fast meets slow, different speeds are really meeting. So if you do have a 2 foot wide bubble seam, you have really you got let's say a slow piece on that side of it. Then you got your merger seam. Then you have the bubble seam itself, and then you have a merger seam where maybe it meets the fast stuff. You get what I'm saying? I'm trying to argue for being very precise about exactly what lane you want to start in and making sure it comes down and stays in one lane. I mean, we can only control so much. So there's some hope and some luck involved, obviously, too. But know where your lane is. And the easiest way to do that is to just follow it upstream. And it is kind of neat if you have leaves on the water, but to follow upstream, see where it came from. But you don't need that. I think you don't need the bubbles. You don't need the leaf. I think we can all just look at the surface and then again, just follow up where it comes from. If there is any flow to it, if it's not like glass flat, then you can see where the lanes are. And these lanes do not have to be as distinct as what I just described. They could be much, well, softer. There could be a softer variation. It's not so distinct. Oh, that's real fast. And then this is much slower. But still try to be very precise about picking apart those lanes.
It's like that axiom that I had this drilled into me. I hunt big game out here in Wyoming, deer and elk, and you're always told aim small, miss small.
Right
So
on.
don't just aim for right behind that front shoulder for the long shot. Pick an exact clump of hair. Pick something exact and aim
Nice.
for that small thing. And I think that same thing could be applied to fly fishing too. And I
Nice.
think continuing this a little bit further, even with the shooting analogy,
Yeah.
I think, especially myself, I looked at dry flies as sort of the sniper. You had to be very accurate. You had to be very perfect with your dry fly drift because fish
Sure.
weren't going to move to come over and eat that.
Yeah.
But, well, when I grew up, I don't know if you know this, I grew up in a family that was a lot like what Norm Maclean describes in A River Runs Through It.
Oh, yeah.
Nice. I didn't know nymphs existed until high school, and I'm being dead serious. Because if it wasn't a dry fly, then we weren't fishing it with my dad, and that's part of the reason I love dry flies so much. But
sure,
we look at that at the dry fly work as very precise work, and then for me, I always thought of nymphing as more of like a shotgun blast. There's a lot more out there. You got 2, maybe even 3 flies that you're nymphing with. And so precision was less important because it didn't matter. Oh, it's just a nymph. They'll move to grab a nymph, right? But I think that's the wrong attitude to have about it.
No,
especially now with the experience that I've had and the fishing I've been able to do. I know that's the wrong attitude to have about it. But I wonder how many beginners think of it that way almost, where it matters less. The precision matters less with nymphs. And I don't think it does. I think it's every bit as important with nymphs as it is with dry flies.
That's really interesting. I don't know if I ever heard it verbalized, but when you were saying that, I'm not surprised. Because I know that it's just a common perception out there, a belief that dry flies is the hardest thing. And then nymphs, you can get away with a lot more. And then I think that most people believe that you can get away with even more on streamers. Now, and wets. Now, I agree with that for the most part.
Yeah.
I think they are more forgiving on, right? They're more forgiving on nymphs. And yet, I'm like you. I say have tight targets. And like you said, that aim small, or would you say aim small, miss small?
Yeah.
Right? Was that it, or did I rephrase it?
Yeah, no, aim small, miss small. If you aim small, you're going to miss smaller. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, and when I coached Little League Baseball, and it's remarkable how many times I could tell the kids, let's say we're having batting practice, and they're maybe hitting the top of the ball, bottom of the ball, and I say, stop watching the ball, look for the center of the ball, find the center of the ball, and then all of a sudden it's solid contact. Just last night, Connor, I said that to Connor, and he started banging the ball, just bam, line drives right back to the pitcher, and it's remarkable. Anyway, if we just tell ourselves small target. So definitely same thing with nymphs. And I do think that precision, it's not going to hurt you, right? If you're thinking about, well, I am going to really be picky about this drift. Don't blame the fish, blame yourself. Know that you can do better. Know that you can get as precise underneath as you can on top. We had a full podcast about what's more difficult to fish. What's more difficult to achieve, a dead drift on a nymph or a dead drift on a dry fly? And people got it very confused. Well, some people said, "Oh, you catch way more on nymphs." I'm like, I didn't say which catches more fish. I'm asking what's harder to achieve. And I believe I think we all of us in the Troutbitten crew there in that podcast kind of agreed that the nymph dead drift, if that's what you're aiming for, is harder to achieve because the true dead drift is harder to achieve simply because you can't see it. Also because there are more complex currents to deal with. You have 3-dimensional currents underneath. You have to deal with depth, and then multiple speeds and currents that are washing this way and that way. And on top, you can see it. Is it dead drifting? Yep. Is it dragging? Yep. Now it's dead. Now it's dragging. Get it the heck out of there. And you have one current to deal with, one surface current. And of course, things can be going left and right, but again, you can see it. So I think the precision is just as important underneath, probably more important because it's so complex under there. But thankfully, trout do seem to be more forgiving underneath on a nymph for a
Yeah,
bunch of different reasons, I bet you.
yeah, no, they certainly do. And yeah, by no means am I trying to sit here and say you've got to be so perfectly precise
No,
with the
thank God,
nymphs.
no.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
We wouldn't catch them.
Yeah, but it's nice to it's nice to know that the opportunity for perfection exists there
Yeah,
with your nymphing game as much as it does with dry flies
yeah.
or whatever else we're going to fish too.
I think another reason that there's that misconception out there is because of the standard way of fishing for so long. The standard way of fishing nymphs was an indicator and a fly line, 9-foot leader, and that's a fine rig if you really understand to operate it. But it's given to many beginners. Like, here you go, and you're just kind of shooting into the dark, right? You really don't understand anything about what's going on, and once I'm saying if you're a beginner, and once the indicator hits the water, you're just kind of you don't know what's going on underneath. You can, if you're trying to do good things above the water, you're mending and trying to keep the tension off that Indian. That's your focus. Not so much about what's that fly doing. You're underneath. You're just hoping that it doesn't hang up on something, and you're also hoping that a fish will eat it. So there's a lot of hope involved in that method. And I didn't start by indicator nymphing. I'm kind of glad for that. What I got into no, right? Like I got into nymphing through Joe Humphrey's books and then VHS tapes. I've told this story before, so I won't elaborate. But that taught me early on how well those resources taught me early on how to nymph. And I just kind of thought that's how you do it. And Joe Humphreys would not fish indicators from what I understand. Like Austin is friends with Joe, and he will not fish indicators still. Boy, I fish everything, right? I fish indies. I fish the rig I just described. I'll throw an indie on a tight line rig. I'll fish tight line all day. I'll fish tight line to the streamers. Sometimes I go tight line to a dry fly, like it's Tenkara. I just like doing everything. But point is, I started by learning those tight line skills, and I was enamored with nymphing right off the bat because I was like, wow, you know where the fly is underneath because you can be in contact with it. That contact is fun because you have a lot of control over it, and well, we enjoy that. And well, you ask why I like fishing. That's why, because there's so much to it. That's going to change every day. And some days I don't have good skills. Some days I just don't have it. It's like a ball player or, an athlete that doesn't, I'm not saying I'm an athlete, but you understand. You can't get in that zone, right? Or even a chess player who can't see the next move that they need to make. And when I don't have it, then it's not a good day for me to tight line. And I'll use a different method. I'll fish streamers or whatever. Um, I I think that if I was if I had a pure beginner, and I've had plenty, most of them been family members or friends. I often will start them if we're going to nymph. First of all, I teach them to fish dry flies for reasons I stated above or before, and also just because it's like the heart of fly fishing. I'm with you. I mean, I started with dry flies when I started fly fishing, and I'm so glad that I started that way because it teaches you to cast. And now even the way I tight line, I cast with my long leader setups. I cast them like a fly line. Point is, I would first teach a beginner to fish dries, and then I'd take that skill if we're going to nymph over to tight lining. And I think it's because it's more entertaining. It's more rewarding because you go, I might be making mistakes, but at least I know next time I'm going to lead my flies slower, or next time I'm going to allow them to drop, or next time I'm going to tuck them in there harder. Or you can really you have that tangible feedback really about uh, how deep your fly's getting. You can feel the bottom. Well, if you're using that kind of method, you can even feel when you just put uh, a heavier fly on there or 30 more centigrams of a split shot. You can not almost, you can feel that load on your rod tip. You're in touch with everything. It's a great way to fish. And I think it's suitable for beginners um, just as much as anybody else.
When you say tight lining, just for those who may not know,
Mm.
explain that just a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, but tight lining is well, it's not my term, but I use that term to generally say mono rig stuff, high sticking stuff, um, Euro nymphing stuff, which used to be broken down into Czech nymphing, Polish nymphing, Spanish nymphing, and French nymphing, and then they would the term Euro nymphing started. And I'm not honestly a fan of the term because it's
Oh
very
yeah, I read
limiting.
the article about it.
Yeah, I won't get into
Yeah,
that. So I don't say Euro nymphing as much. I tend to
yeah,
say tight lining, but most people would say, okay, you're talking about a Euro nymphing rig. Fine. Yeah. There are differences and we could pursue that
yeah.
at a later time.
It's the concept of a very long monofilament leader
Yeah.
attached to your flies, and you're in contact with those flies. There's no strike indicator, and you're
Well, yeah. Yeah.
guiding them through the water, right?
Right. Now I raise my eyebrows because sometimes I attach a strike indicator to my tight line rig and it casts quite well if you have good casting skills. The other thing is there's so many, again, not to go down this rabbit hole, but we'll just look into it for a second. Look down into the rabbit hole for a second. There's there are many different tight line systems, many different mono rig styles. This long leader you're talking about, if you go super, super thin, what people call a micro rig these days, or a micro Euro nymphing setup or whatever, really skinny leaders, you have no power and punch to push things around. So you're relying on the weight of the fly to pull the leader behind it. That's what gets you there. And they might not be, right? And you can fish a micro rig even with a full centigram of weight if you wanted to, but most times you're not, and you're more in the 10 to 20, maybe 30 centigram range. And I'm with you. They're probably not going to be all that heavy if you're fishing a micro rig. Point is, you can use that leader and it catches fish and it's great and it might be your favorite tool. But we should also acknowledge there's the other tool out there. There are other tools, other leader builds that, well, I use one that's 20-pound Maxima Chameleon. And that leader, you can stand there and cast it like a fly line. I say this all the time, just so that people understand, like you can get fly line performance. I often describe it as a hybrid rig. You can do fly line things with it. You can stand there and cast a dry fly with it. You can't cast a dry fly with a micro rig. I'm not talking dry dropper, but just pure dry fly. You can seriously cast, not 50 feet, but you can get fly casting stroke, and you should have that with that leader. Anyway, I don't fish dries too much on a mono rig. I'm saying it's possible, and my point is that rig can push things to a target then. So it can push those light nymphs. Say we're just fishing a number 18 that's less than 10 centigrams, right? If we're talking about tungsten bead, and you're just casting 10 centigrams out there, and like you said, it's so light. But now I can use the power and the punch, the push of that leader to, well, get it to the target instead of having to rely on just 10 centigrams to pull my leader. So it's a hybrid kind of system. Whereas the micro rig, I'm going to say, is very, very specialized. And both of them are fun. You can do a lot of different stuff, right? It's fun. You can, and then the 9-foot leader with a fly line, that's fun too.
Yeah. Oh, I agree, and that's one of the interesting things about this is that you can really just dial it all into whatever it is you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
You can find something specific, some way to fish that you love to fish, and then you can just go nuts on that particular technique
Yeah.
and method, and really dial that in for your own local fisheries. I do that. I fish dry dropper rigs more than I fish anything else, I think.
Mm.
In fact, not I think, I know I do for a fact. I
Yeah.
know that's what I fish more than anything else. And I do kind of have a little system dialed in for these creeks out here in the Rockies where, like, oh, well, I need, these 10 flies and that'll get me through all of summer, these 10 different patterns. Um, but that's because I've kind of specialized in it. But
do you go through phases of, I don't know, fishing dry dropper a lot now, you're saying, but did you ever go through like a long phase of fishing streamers or I don't know, something. I'm in the game long enough that that's what I do. Like I'm in a leader phase. That's probably why I write about it so much right now. I'm experimenting with all kinds of different leaders, and
I
then I'll stop
haven't.
that for a while.
I don't think so. I really I nymphed really hard in oh my last year of high school through my first year at college. So
Mm-hmm.
I nymphed really hard then because I sucked at it and I
Yeah,
wanted
right,
to figure it out because I'd
right.
go the again, I lived 20 minutes from the lower Provo River when
Mm-hmm.
I was in college. So, and that's a really great little tailwater to be on. But I'd go out there with my buddies, and they would just routinely kick my butt
Yeah,
all over the place, and I was getting sick of it.
yeah.
So,
That's a little
eh,
inspiration. Yeah.
yeah, and so I was like, all
So,
right, I've got to
yeah,
figure this nymphing thing out because
yeah, sure.
I'm fishing the same flies, I'm doing the same stuff they are. Why the
Yeah,
heck ain't I catching a fish?
right.
Well, I
Tight
wasn't
targets.
doing the
That's what
same
you
things
need.
they were because
Right.
they were in the right lanes, they were at the right
Yeah.
depth.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't. We were fishing the same flies. That was the only thing we had in common. Was we were
Yeah, yeah,
fishing the
yeah.
same flies. My drifts were all over the place, but I figured that part of it out. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think, other than that, I've really gone through a phase though. It's been. I like to find what works, and then
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like to see what I can catch with that.
Nice.
And for me, I love fishing dry flies so much that
Yeah.
I'm loath to cut off a dry fly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can count on one hand how many times I've gone out and just nymphed with no dry flies in the last year.
Really? You mean
Mm-hmm.
in the last year? Yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
in the last year. So
Around
it's
here,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. Go ahead, Dom.
Um, Sorry about that. Around here, there are a lot of. I mean, it's nymphing as you, that's your go-to. It's the standard because we really. I mean, you're gonna have a hard time. Anyone would have a hard time finding rising trout tomorrow, and the olives are starting, but not for long enough, not predictably enough. Oh yeah, you could find them, but you're gonna have a hard time, right? Not in January. No, it just was. You weren't gonna find rising trout in January, except for when you have that sunny day and you know where the spring water is around 11 o'clock. You can find uh, small trout feeding on midges for an hour and a half if you're lucky.
And that makes
Um,
my day when I find that stuff.
oh yeah, me too.
That's the magic for
Yeah,
me. And really,
it's
this is my nymphing time of the year right now. Is
oh yeah.
January, February, and then once we get into March, I'm back on that dry dropper binge really
Yep.
hard.
It's unpredictable for us where to find those dry fly hatches. And be quite honest, people often, when I'm setting up guide trips, and there people get in touch. Many people say, "Well, what's the best time of the year to fish?" I'm like, "Well, around here, it's almost all year. I don't like August, and I do like January, but I don't like guiding in those months, so I don't. Um, the days are kind of shortened, right, on each on the extreme sides of that spectrum, right? Um, I fish all summer long with dry flies as my go-to. I say summer, I'm talking about mid-June to about beginning of October. That's what I do as my go-to thing because it works, and I love fishing dries whenever it'll work. Being versatile, being ready and willing to do everything. That's cool. But I also go through phases. Like I said, I fished streamers for 10 months, almost a full year. I mean nothing else. Like I maybe put on dry flies 10 times. I was on the water almost every day. And maybe 10 times because the hatch was so good. I'm like, all right, I'm not passing that up. Interestingly, I'd fish right through rising trout with a streamer and they eat it, you know. I learned something by just fishing one style. If we're talking to beginners here specifically, that just made me think. I think it's a really good point, or it's a really good thing to do. Um, Pick one thing. Pick one thing and do it tomorrow. If you're going out fishing tomorrow, don't try to be versatile. If you're a beginner, don't try to be versatile. Um, I feel like I need to say that to people a lot because I'm always saying, "Oh, you got to do this, you got to adjust that," and if they're not eating, accept that they're saying no and change it and make them say yes, that kind of thing. but not when you're a beginner. And I spent 5 years just tight lining, short tight lining with nymphs. And I would skip 80% of the river and I'd go up to the next pocket water or the next heavy run because it was working. I mean it. I spent like 5 years doing that. Maybe not skipping 80% of the water, but I'd skip a lot of situations just because I knew what I liked doing, like you with your dry dropper right now. I knew what I liked the best, and I knew what I was trying to learn. And I continued, and I was catching fish too. And I continued to take myself into those situations where I could do one thing. I've been telling people too, beginner or otherwise, like do something repeatable. That's another sports analogy, right? The more you do the same thing over and over, the better you get at it. And so that even means the same length of line, the same angle, the same weight perhaps, and choose the same water, like I was just talking about, the same type of water. Set yourself up to do repeatable things and you'll learn faster. As a beginner, you'll make a lot more progress if you try to do one thing tomorrow. Say, I'm only going to tight line the heavy riffles, not even heavy runs, just find heavy riffles. And that's what I'm going to do. Or dry dropper in I don't know, in tailouts. I'm just making that up, right? One thing, repeatable things. That's a good strategy.
It is, and I think I love the comment about versatility because my Achilles heel as an angler is that I'm not versatile enough to a fault because I will refuse to fish when me and Alex are out fishing the other guy here at VFC with me when he and I are out fishing together. Uh, he'll be nymphing, and that's always a joke because he always nymphs and I always fish dries. And it takes a sizable amount of fish that he's caught for me to switch over and switch over to that because I just kind of refuse to. I want to go out and do it this way that I enjoy so much.
Oh yeah,
But
enjoyment. It has to be enjoyable,
yeah,
or you
it
don't do it,
does.
right?
And it's not that I don't enjoy nymphing. It's
Sure,
just
you know what you like.
I love that visual of the dry
Mhm.
fly.
Mhm.
And half the time I'm using the dry as an indicator for the nymphs anyways because I feel like it's a more sensitive indicator than a strike indicator.
Sure.
And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's probably a whole other podcast discussion right
We've
there.
had we had one on indicator styles. Our conclusion is we love the Dorsey yarn indicator. You ever use that one? Pat Dorsey's. I don't know where he picked it up. We all called it Dorsey. It's just rubber band and macrame yarn. And I don't put much yarn. I've seen, he makes big bushy ones on a video that he has out there. I've never fished with him. I've talked to a lot of people that had him as a guide, and they say, "Oh my, he uses a lot more yarn." But I just use what I need.
You ever use
And
a
yeah,
you
it's
ever
light.
use a balloon as an indicator?
Yeah, I did. It lagged for me more than I expected it to. I thought it was going to be real light, and maybe I had it, too big. But it was pretty. It was pretty small. Do you like the
Yeah.
balloons?
Yeah, I fished those for the first time last year, and I was
Mm,
surprised at how good it was. It was real light. The only thing that's tough with
that's
them is
light.
it's tough to adjust um, the depth.
Did you have? Oh, see, I felt like that was for me a benefit of it, right? Like, isn't that something? Like, seriously, you and I have completely different
Yeah,
experiences there. I felt like I could just slide it up and down the way I had it rigged. Lance Webb
yeah.
showed me that.
Well, and I don't think I probably didn't have it rigged correctly because it just wasn't sliding up and down on my leader correctly.
There's
But
probably different ways to do it. You could grease it
yeah,
up too, you
yeah,
know?
and I tried to do it the way my buddy did, but
Yeah.
I'd never fished with balloons before, and I really liked that.
I thought
Especially
it,
it was
yeah,
early season. The fish were a lot softer. They weren't smacking it like
yeah.
they will when hatches really get into full swing. But
That's what I love about that Dorsey, that just yarn and a rubber band. It's way different than the yarn indies that have the black O-rings, two black O-ring. That's heavier. Those are okay, but they don't adjust easily. And anyway, the Dorsey is completely, uh, it's so sensitive, and that's why I love it. I used the balloons. I said lagging in the cast. I mean, I felt like it had an air resistance to it. Well, without then the weight of a bobber to overcome that air resistance, right? It was strange. It had a strange casting feel. I only used it for one day, but I committed a whole day to it.
yeah, oh,
I didn't like
that's
it
cool.
enough. I was like, eh. I love my Dorsey.
So I'd like to end with this last question. I was going to ask you
Hmm.
what feels so satisfying for you about nymphing, but I think we touched on that pretty well
Yeah.
tonight.
True.
What I would like to end with though is we've talked we focused on the beginners. We've talked a lot about the things that they need to do.
Mm.
You got to get low enough for long enough. You got to get in the right
Mm.
lane.
Yeah.
And what was the third one? Why
Get
am I
close.
blanking? Close
Yeah.
enough. Yeah,
Close.
close
Yeah.
enough. Thank you. I haven't had enough Diet Coke today. That's what I'm blaming it on. Or maybe too much. Maybe I'm too tired now.
Right. Cross the line.
Yeah. Uh, but if someone wants to move beyond those basics and they
Mm.
want to try to up their nymphing game, what is one thing you tell them to focus on next beyond those three? Because those are the three things that we need for if we're going to
Yeah.
nymph successfully. But what else beyond that?
Oh,
If,
there's a lot. There's a lot more,
yeah,
right? But I'll pick a couple.
yeah,
And I think a lot about there are multiple ways to get a dead drift. We know that a dead drift should be in one lane, but then what zone do you want to be in? And we've talked about this on our podcast not too long ago. How much influence do you want to have over the fly? Let's say all of that is more in your control on a tight line rig, but you can use these. You can be thinking about those same principles and making decisions around those principles, also under an indicator. So, three different ways to get a dead drift. You can get really low and tick the bottom. And I'd argue that that's a great way to start. Overweight the system. I'm not talking about a whole bunch of weight, but overweight a little bit so that you can kind of, oh, I hate to use the word anchor because again, I'm not saying it has to be all heavy, but you can kind of anchor yourself down there. Keep
well, then
yourself
you know
in.
where the bottom is, and then
Yeah,
it's slight adjustments after
sure.
that. You do
Right.
the one big one, you find out where it is, and then make little adjustments from there.
That's a great way to put it. That's right. You find that bottom and then you back off a touch. Right on. And you can do that under an indicator with weight and distance. Yeah. And you can do it arguably even with more control with a tight line. So that's one way to get a dead drift. And I believe that there are bugs down there, not banging their heads against rocks, but that look like that drift. And I think it's really neat to think about. Um, and then the second way is I brought up that strike zone. It's that cushion of water that's going slower. I think that's where the best stuff is happening. The trout are in the strike zone, and most of the bugs are. They spend most of their life on the rock or drifting in the strike zone if they lift off the rock or get washed off, lift off on purpose. And then, so that's another place that you can get a dead drift in. And then another way to get a dead drift is somewhere up in the middle of the column. I wouldn't try to get a nymph drift up on top unless, you're talking about emergers. Fair enough. But what goes along with all three of those zones is again more or less influence. And they all, I mean, if you think about it again from the bottom, I said overweight, so you're going to have more influence. Weight equals influence. That's the fundamental factor. Kind of talking through a lot of the stuff Austin and I have recently on the podcast. And more weight is going to give you more influence, and it is easier to learn it. Doesn't mean it's a lesser than system. It's easier to learn it and know that you're in control. And then you could back off that weight a little bit. But if you back off the weight a lot, you can get a really long drop time. Again, under an Indy or tight line. If you do that number 18 or 10, 10 centigrams like we were talking about earlier, I think it could be split shot or weighted fly. It doesn't matter. If you really back off the weight, you can get very long drop times on your nymphs that is going to keep them above the fish for longer. And again, like we talked about really early on here, that you can keep it in their zone, in their sight, in their focus point for longer. And obviously, I mean, I think it's obvious that there's not a whole lot that's just nymphs aren't really dropping through the water column, right? So does that really look natural? Now, there are caddis that swim to the bottom to lay eggs, right? We know that. I'm sure the nymphs are sometimes swimming back down. But for the most part, I don't think anything really looks like a nymph that's dropping. So if you can kind of slow that drop, it might look a little bit more natural. A plummeting nymph, they hardly ever, if I'm really overweighting, I don't get anything on the drop, but I'm not trying to get anything on the drop. If I get that right on. If I'm kind of fishing mid-range weight, I get plenty of hits on the drop, but there's a lot to it, right? I don't know. I certainly didn't simplify anything there. Just given maybe a couple of points to think about. We make choices, right? But make those choices based on something. I guess I was saying earlier, maybe I'll wrap it up here with this. I was saying earlier to pick one thing, choose one thing, and try to get good at that. Do that tomorrow. Maybe do that the next day. Maybe do that for the next month. But then when you decide, I'm really starting to get a handle on this, and instead of just fishing the fast riffles, I'm going to try to fish something else. But why? Now you start to bring in what you were talking about earlier. Why am I going to make that change? And not really necessarily why are they eating this way or that way, but why is the fun question. And why am I going to make that change? Don't just make changes just to try something. Oh, I wanted to try it. I put on a woolly bugger because nothing else was working. Nah, woolly bugger's fine, but have a reason, why you're doing that. If you're, for just one example, if you're walking upstream and you're fishing the deep stuff, and you, Spencer, and I have seen this a lot, you keep kicking off fish out of the shallow stuff from the shallow bank. And you go, man, I guess I should be fishing that shallow bank. And so that's an easy change to make. It's an easy, you're redirecting yourself. It's an easy decision then. But you have that data from the fish, and so you make the change. But I wouldn't just go out randomly making changes. And for the most part, early on, to beginners, the message would be pick one thing and get good at it.
Cool. Well, I think that's wonderful stuff to go with, Dom. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Thanks for being with us. And if folks want to find you and all the wonderful stuff they do, where would you send them?
Troutbitten.com. It's easy to find. On the homepage, kind of leads you to everything. Like I said, like we talked about, things have changed a lot. Coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Troutbitten.
Well, it's been that long. Congratulations.
Right? Isn't that something?
Yeah.
It's a long time. And so there's a lot now. There's the podcasts and the videos, and there's a online shop. I sell a lot of leaders at various times of the year. I have those in stock. So there's a bunch of different branches, and the website will lead you to all those different branches. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of as well through the website. My email's there. That's definitely the hub for everything.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure we send folks there, and thank you again for your time, Dom. I really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. I always love these discussions. I told you earlier, I don't really like people, but I like fishermen. I like anglers.
Well, you know what? I think ditto for that over here.
These are always good conversations, is what I'm saying. I appreciate it. That's a lot of fun.
You bet. Thanks so much, Dom.